My father, Max Maynard, was born in India in a somewhat indeterminate year. He said 1903. I suspect it may have been earlier. He was a man not without some vanity. This is my father over here. And he shaved a few years off of his age, particularly because he was already in his 50s when I came along. And he had a very colorful life as a young man. His parents were Christian missionaries who had left the Salvation Army because it was too liberal. My father was raised on one book and one book only, and that was the Bible, which he had committed to memory, along with a lot of great poetry that he made a point of memorizing himself. But he had a passion for art, and I have to say, I have never known a person who had a greater passion for art. So he always drew and he always painted. His parents confiscated, it was one of the great stories that he told me as a child, that his parents confiscated his paint box because it flew in the face of their religion, but he did not stop painting. I believe I have heard from people on the west coast of Canada where the family emigrated from India and then England in the early part of the 20th century, that my father was the first person to introduce the images of Picasso to the wilds of British Columbia. And he was a protege and follower of a group of early modern artists known as the Group of Seven, who are not particularly known in these parts, but very well known in Canada. And as a young man, he was a full-time painter and a full-time carouser, and led a pretty wild and, I'm afraid, somewhat dissolute life, probably in Canada. And then he went to sort of clean up his act to Winnipeg, Manitoba. Some of these images are from Winnipeg, a very different kind of place from the wilds of, the pioneer Western Canada, where he somehow incongruously got a job as a very junior English professor, where he was assigned as his teaching helper, a 16-year-old student who was specifically given to him because it was believed she would be the one person absolutely immune to his substantial charms, and that was my mother. And the fact that he was over 20 years older than her and not Jewish did not keep him from breaking down the immunity, and he chased her first to Toronto, and ultimately my mother, a daughter of Russian immigrant Jews, got a full scholarship to Harvard and went off to Harvard, and he chased after her. 8 years this pursuit had gone on, painting her paintings, drawing portraits of her, and writing her poetry, and he settled the closest that he could get to Harvard, which was New Hampshire, and got a position at the University of New Hampshire in the 1940s, and taught English at the University of New Hampshire in those days. And there actually is somebody here today who grew up in Durham in those years, and whose father was the chairman of that English department, in whose house my parents were married in 1948. Dudley, you may know her name because hers is an important name in New Hampshire political history. But my father taught English at the University of New Hampshire back when it was sort of an ag school almost. But every night, my father was not a Sunday painter. My father was a man with a passionate attachment to painting, and every night of his life he climbed the stairs to our attic and painted. And never in all the years, and there were 30 of them, that he taught at the University of New Hampshire, always as a very junior, unpromoted professor, and lectured, I think, quite passionately on art and paintings in the humanities program. Never did he show his work. There is actually his one Durham collector is here tonight, and that is my dear friend and his colleague, Professor Mel Bobick from the classics department at UNH, who recognized my father's paintings when nobody else did, and that was a source of indescribable pride and joy to him. It was an enormous frustration, and I think I could truly say heartbreak to my father that his paintings were never shown. Some of the paintings in this room, and many that are in my possession in my house in California, have little 3x5 cards on the back that say $25, and that were shown in the New Hampshire Art Association and clearly did not sell. When my father retired from the university, and He was not somebody who went gently into the night. I should say that my father was an alcoholic. My father climbed the stairs to our attic to paint and to drink, and the two were pretty inextricably linked. And he painted through the night with a kind of fury. When one of my clearest memories of my father during the years of my growing up is of him confronting anybody who came to our door who he felt was an important person to make contact with a single question, which was, "Tell me, man, what is beauty?" This is very embarrassing if you're a 16-year-old girl. And this is "Tell me, man, what is beauty?" When my father retired in 1971, he was in pretty advanced stages of alcoholism, and my parents' marriage fell apart. He was at this point probably in his 70s, it's a little hard to determine, and he moved to Peterborough. And he actually, if some of you know the name of Fletcher Dole, a piece of Peterborough history, because he's rumored to have been the inspiration for characters or a particular character in our town. My father rented a tiny little apartment. He had no money, no health, and no sobriety. And he lived in Peterborough, and he continued to draw and paint. I should say that my father was a passionate lover of the outdoors and landscape. The most searing and tender memories of my childhood were of going sketching with my father, which we did every Saturday of my life. He was an extraordinary drawer and an extraordinary eye. So you could not take a walk with my father without him pointing his walking stick. He was very British, and he pointed his walking stick, and he would just stop, and he'd say, "Chum!" And then you would have to look, and it would be about the light or the sound of a bird or a particular cloud formation. And then you could continue on. And then we would draw. And I think we documented every square foot of the UNH horticulture farm during the years of my growing up. And then he continued to do that in Peterborough and Wilton area. So there are actually sketches and drawings of this area, as well as British Columbia and the New Hampshire seacoast. In 1979, when my daughter, Audrey, who is here tonight also, to my great joy and pride, was 1 year old, my father announced that he was returning to Western Canada. He was a very old, very ill man. He had, thanks to AA in Peterborough, he wasn't sober, but he had gotten in a little bit better shape, and he was a famous AA speaker. I think he got many other people sober, although he was an inspirational lecturer always. And he announced that he was returning to Western Canada to resume his career as a painter. I didn't think that he would survive the plane trip. He had no health, no money. All he brought back to Canada really were his paints and his paintings, his lifetime collection of paintings. And amazingly, he was discovered at the age of 75. He was discovered by some lovers of Canadian art history, and he had a couple of shows. My father never stopped sketching and drawing. At the age of 78, he announced that he, having continued to paint and sketch, even though his hands were crippled like this, the landscape of Western Canada again, that he wanted a new landscape, and so he was taking a cruise to Alaska. He actually invited me to come along, but I was pregnant with my second child. It wasn't a very convenient time to cruise to Alaska. And so he went alone to Alaska, and he spent the entire week, and actually none of those artworks are here on these walls, although there are some in my collection that is now a New Hampshire-based collection. And they all show the bar of the ship's deck, because he sat on the ship's deck and he painted Alaska, drew and painted Alaska for that week. But my father got pneumonia on that trip. That was the winter of 1981, and he really never recovered. And the pneumonia brought back a pretty severe relapse of the drinking, and my father was never okay again, and died in the fall of 1982, 28 years ago, a few months after the birth of my first son. And these paintings, although